Nzimande.
Distinguished academics, colleagues, and guests, allow me to greet you this morning. It is both an honor and a privilege to address you this morning on the topic, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the Church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice in South Africa," with a specific focus on responsible stewardship. Please do note that what I offer here is not a formal academic paper in the traditional sense, but rather a series of critical reflections rooted in theological, cultural, and contextual insight. These reflections seek to contribute meaningfully to our shared dialogue on urgent ecological and socio-economic concerns. It is indeed a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for that introduction. The framework that will be guiding this reflection is what Ezra Chitando and Chama Kawunda have termed the theo-decolonial imagination. As Kawunda notes, this approach represents a struggle to conceptualize how pre-colonial African social orders functioned, while critically reimagining the contemporary African Christian experience. Crucially, this is not a call for cultural romanticism or revivalism, but a liberative endeavor to reinterpret life-giving cultural elements in light of present-day realities, particularly those involving ecological degradation, economic inequality, and socio-political exploitation. Our framework is the theo-decolonial imagination that offers us a powerful lens for addressing the interconnected crises of climate change, food insecurity, and socio-economic injustice. This lens provides a framework for African solutions to African problems, firmly rooted in contextual theology and indigenous wisdom traditions. I will employ this theo-decolonial imagination as it offers African solutions for African problems when it comes to the Church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa. And it also speaks on responsible stewardship. Philosophical and theological traditions agree that human beings are moral agents, capable of discerning right from wrong and bearing responsibility for their actions. The call to responsible stewardship is therefore not an undue expectation, but it is a direct expression of human moral agency. In our capacity as image bearers of God, we are entrusted with the care of creation and can be held accountable for both our engagement and our neglect. The Cambridge Dictionary defines responsibility as being in a position of authority over someone or something, with the duty to ensure that things are done correctly. However, terms that are synonymous with responsibility, such as blame, fault, or even liability, often evoke negative emotions like guilt or resentment. It is Fisher and Ravizza who propose a more constructive view, and they say that responsibility can be understood as an expression of responsive gratitude, respect, and even praise. From this perspective, then, responsible stewardship is not a burden, but a privilege. The biblical creation narrative in Genesis 1 supports this understanding. In the order of creation, God created light, the atmosphere, dry grounds and plants, the sun, the moon and stars, birds and sea creatures, land and animals, and then human beings. Humanity is created last and entrusted with dominion over creation. Now, the Hebrew term rada, which is dominion, can be interpreted in two primary ways. Dominion, rada in Hebrew. Rada can be seen as ruling with care and responsibility. Rada as domination and subjugation, if you choose to look at it that way. But a more theologically faithful interpretation, as argued by Stephen, aligns with the former. Rada implies an ethic of environmental responsibility, not a license for exploitation. According to Stephen, dominion, rada in Hebrew, rada is an action word which connotes an ethic of environmental responsibility. It is not an authorization for callous disregard of the natural world. And so as we explore this topic of responsible stewardship, a few shifts are critical as we embark on the search for the church's role in climate change, food security, socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa. A shift from an anthropocentric to an ecocentric view of moral agency is critical. It cannot be that everything is about human beings. And so we need to move from that. A shift from domination to collaboration with the ecosystem becomes necessary for responsible stewardship. A shift from viewing stewardship as burdensome to understanding it as a grateful response to divine abundance is necessary. It is against this backdrop, then, that I offer my thoughts on responsible stewardship, using the theo-decolonial imagination and shifting from those things that I have mentioned. I note that there are various keynote speakers during the course of the next 2 days who will pay particular attention to the three focus areas encompassed in the greater topic. I will therefore limit my paper to responsible stewardship as a broad foundation for what is to come in the week. To illustrate responsible stewardship through a theo-decolonial lens, I want to offer two African cultural metaphors drawn from pre-colonial traditions. These images serve not as nostalgic gestures, but as contextual theological tools. Remember, the lens we are using, theo-decolonial. And so I offer you two metaphors from pre-colonial traditions. The first metaphor is inspired by the Zulu traditional dances known as abasini. I have watched Zulu dancers, abasini, with great fascination and have taken note of the following. The attire of the dancers is always the same, and they sing the same songs. However, Before a dance begins, one of them steps away from the larger group and assumes the lead position. She or he dances alone before the rest of the group joins in. This person in Zulu traditional dancing is known as igosa, a steward. They are chosen from amongst many, not only to ensure synchronicity in the dance, but to energize the rest of the team and to set the standard of the performance. It is only after igosa has opened the dance floor that the others then take their cue from igosa and emulate the movement. Beyond the stage and the limelight, igosa promotes the values of the dancing group and has to be exemplary in conduct and character, because unto whom much is given, much is expected. This is never an onerous thing for igosa to do, but it is deemed as an honor with the challenge to keep on raising the bar. A pre-colonial image, theo-decolonial imagination. Through this pre-colonial and contemporary image of Zulu traditional dances, we encounter people who are called amagosa, translated into English, stewards. They exercise a form of delegated responsibility over their assigned jurisdiction for the well-being of the entity to which they have oversight. They are not supreme, neither are they meant to be superior. They are one amongst many. They understand their role as part of the bigger scheme of things. The igosa does not assume superiority, but exercises delegated responsibility. They lead not for power's sake, but for the well-being of the collective. This is stewardship, not as burden, but as an honor and calling. And it reflects the church's role and the church's vocation, called among the people, not above them, but called to guide with humility and integrity. The church's role in responsible stewardship. The second metaphor that I offer you is the African drum. Beyond its role as a musical instrument, the drum has historically served to capture the heartbeat of the community. Before phones, drums were used to communicate within and across communities. In ages gone by, it heralded important events and ceremonies, for example, births or deaths. A certain drum beat called people together for gatherings and meetings. Certain drum beats called people to unity, action, or sacred observance. Certain drumming rhythms were believed to invite good spirits, and some were believed to ward off evil spirit. It is the drummer who would communicate the message and become the herald, but it is not the drummer who holds the message, but the one who sends the drummer. The drummer in this particular metaphor is not the originator of the message, but the herald of another's call, much like the church, which amplifies God's summons to justice and care. The drum becomes a medium of communal identity, moral imagination, and spiritual mobilization. I've offered you two metaphors. Now let's join the dots and bring these two metaphors of igosa and the drum to the church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice challenges in South Africa for responsible stewardship. Let's join it. Taken together, the igosa and the drum reflects the dual aspects of the church's role: to lead responsibly and to speak prophetically. The word church, you will recall from the Greek word ecclesia, means assembly or called out ones. The church is not a building or the hierarchy, but a community of people belonging to God as the Laos, God's people. The church is called not only to gather in worship, but to scatter in service. And therefore, the call to respond to climate change, food insecurity, and socio-economic injustice is addressed to the entire body of believers. It is a collective and yet also an individual responsibility grounded in theology, culture, and the moral agency of each Christian. And so in the face of climate degradation, growing food insecurity, and persistent socio-economic inequality, the church in South Africa must recover its prophetic voice and its role as a faithful steward. Through the lens of the theo-decolonial imagination and by drawing on rich African metaphors like the igosa and the drum, we find that responsible stewardship is not merely a duty, but it is a sacred vocation. To steward creation faithfully is to honor both the Creator and the community. It is ultimately to affirm that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Now, there are many models that seek to define the church, ranging from the institutional model to that of the church as an organism. And there are many in between. But the one model that speaks most directly to the topic at hand is the church as the herald. An image that resonates deeply with that of the drum. According to Avery, the church as herald is best described as the one who receives an official message with a commission to pass it on. The central image is that of a royal herald who comes to the public square to proclaim a royal decree. Now, there is a striking parallel between this role and the pre-colonial function of the drum. Like the drum, the church is called to herald the message entrusted to it by the king. The church, kuriakon, meaning belonging to God, is a messenger of the good news. It beats the drum of life, proclaiming that Christ has come so that we may have life and have it in abundance. This abundance is not a distant utopian promise reserved for the afterlife. It is for the here and the now. And it is for the entire created order. It crosses socio-political, socio-economic, and ecological lines in its pursuit of wholeness. Responsible stewardship recognizes the church's role as both drum and herald in a world longing for liberation from oppression, from inequality, and from exploitation of both human and non-human creation. Tragically, the church has forgotten its prophetic and charismatic calling, and in many contexts has become domesticated. And yet our theological heritage is one of contextual public theology and mission. We come from a lineage that once boldly addressed societal issues such as poverty, oppression, political injustice, and slavery, concrete expressions of the church's vocation. Just as the drum cannot beat itself and requires human agency, the church must actively beat the drum and become the voice of the voiceless. Who are the silenced in society? The list is endless. The environment, the poor, the marginalized, and the excluded. The church is called to beat the drum of liberation and proclaim release to the captives through word and action. And I echo the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who said, there comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river, We need to go upstream and find out why are they falling in. And that time is now. With urgency, the church must become visible at the center of people's suffering, pain, and struggle. It must become the prophetic drum beating loudly for the liberation of the created order. It is in the DNA of the church to respond to the cries of creation, because the parent of the church, God, is the God who hears and responds. A church that does not respond to contextual suffering is irrelevant. It becomes nothing more than just a glorified institution. The church in Acts responded to the needs of its community and became a refuge. In following Christ, who is the criterion for the church, we learn the importance of both the vertical, God and human, and the horizontal, human and creation relationships. These move us from pious religion to a liberating one. And so responsible stewardship involves listening to and attending to the cries of the oppressed. And Maltman will affirm that people are suffering from economic exploitation and crying out for social justice. People are suffering from political oppression and are fighting for the recognition of their dignity and rights. Maltman would argue that people are suffering from cultural alienation through racialism and sexual discrimination and are seeking the fullness of a truly human life in solidarity. People are suffering existentially in technocentric, bureaucratic societies, and they seek identity. People suffer under capitalism, dictatorship, racism, sexism, nihilism, driven by a primal fear that breeds aggression. And responsible stewardship must respond. Consider the words of the world scientists' warning to humanity, signed by 1,575 scientists, which states, "Human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. Human activities inflict harsh and often irreversible damage on the environment and on critical resources. If not checked, many of our current practices put at risk the future we wish for human society and plant and animal kingdom, and may so alter the living world that we will be unable to sustain life in the manner we know." We are on a collision course. Amongst the many stressed areas is the atmosphere, oceans, water resources, forests, and biodiversity. The church is called to respond to these groanings, and so our mission, our budget, our time, and human resources must be directed towards this healing. Our response as responsible stewards must offer both immediate relief and long-term relief and empowerment to restore the dignity of the oppressed. Responsible stewardship requires us to be the drum that calls South Africa out of apathy on corruption, on economic injustice, on political exploitation. The church must become Igosa, the dancer who leads and sets the rhythm. People learn from Igosa. They follow her pace and her energy. And responsible stewardship calls us to that. The church must disturb the systems and structures that bring harm to the created order. Here, Professor Smangaliso Khumalo, when he says the church has no alternative but to be involved in the processes of transformation taking place within society. To do otherwise will be detrimental to its mission in the world, and in effect, the church will become an irrelevant institution. But the igosa leads the dance within community. The drum beats within community. The site, the context is community. Without community, the rhythm is meaningless. And John Wesley would remind us that there are no holy solitaries, and we are called to social holiness. Responsible stewardship is rooted in community, where scarcity and abundance are managed for sustainability and for flourishing. The drum and igosa are liberating images of communal rhythm, harmony, and interdependence. The drum and igosa are liberating images of community, of a social order where all things are interconnected, of a social order where a rhythm is established and communicated, and a community joins in. Let us consider community now, utilizing the theo-decolonial imagination lens. In African thought, an individual is born into and shaped by community. When a child is born, the community rejoices, for the clan will live on through this child. Interconnectedness defines life. The African worldview teaches that one's life is linked to family, ancestors, tribe, nature, and God. And because of this interconnectedness, there is no room for exploitation when interconnectedness is respected. African solutions for African problems. When one part suffers, the whole body suffers. Traditional economies like exchanging potatoes for cabbages or storing grain in the king's storehouse reflected communal care. The Ndebele tribe's kings collected a percentage of the harvest to maintain grain reserves for the poor and the orphans. No one lacked or starved, because being in community entailed caring for my neighbor. The drum beats in community. The interconnectedness of life must be observed if we are going to be responsible stewards. The interconnectedness of life compels us to think of the world as the oikos of God. And the word oikos originally related to the family and a physical house. And it would later be used to refer to the Christian church. Psalm 24 verse 1, the earth is the Lord's and all in it, together with the argued interconnectedness, affirms the notion that the world is God's household. And God assigns every part of creation its role. The atmosphere gives us the air we breathe. The clouds give us rain. The trees and plants give us a harvest. The sun gives us heat and light. In the household of God, everyone and everything has a role. The understanding that life was interconnected and a symbiotic ecosystem ensured that there was peace, harmony, respect for creation and life. God was revered as omnipresent, and life itself was an act of worship and an act of faith. And therefore, responsible stewardship happens when there is a recognition that humans form part of this household. There are other parts, and all of life is interrelated. It is the circle of life and not the pyramid of life. And in this circle of life, the principles of okomia, the management and dispensation of the resources of God's household, must be monitored for sustainability. And so there remains a necessity for humans and ecology to symbiotically serve one another and cease to be on a collision course. Is this then not what the Greek philosophers would call koinonia? The Webster Dictionary defines koinonia as the intimate spiritual communion and participative sharing in common religious and spiritual community. And we have limited koinonia to the fellowship with God. We've limited it to something just mystical and limited to the spiritual. But koinonia is more than fellowship with God and other believers. It incorporates fellowship with nature, the environment, as an entity in the household of God. Stewardship happens when humans see themselves as part of the ecosystem, not at the top, but within the circle of life. And this is oikonomia, the management of God's household, and it must be ethical and sustainable. In African thought, nature dances to the tune of God's song. Nature is not just something to be abused, exploited, and manipulated through processes that enrich us. It is to be respected as a sibling in the household of God. Here there is fellowship between the Creator and the created. It is for this reason that some African tribes have a special way of even slaughtering animals because of this sacred interconnectedness. They burn incense and speak to the animal and ancestors before they slaughter, because all things are connected and there is fellowship. That is why an African will shake umboti from ukhamba. They will shake it and swirl it around, giving thanks to umvelingangi, God, for food and drink before they raise it. Animals and nature are one with Africans. God speaks through nature. Theo-decolonial imagination takes us back to that. Rain is seen as a blessing. Illness and death are seen as a dark cloud. Some animals are seen as totems. For example, a snake, gojola, is a symbol of the presence of the spirit. And funny enough, they always appear at the relevant times. And so responsible stewardship is oikos, oikomos, and koinonia. When the drum was beaten, the entire community stopped and took heed of the message of the drum and complied. The interconnectedness of community would take the message communicated by the drum into their daily lives. It is noteworthy that there was no compartmentalization of life, but the message of the drum was for life in its totality. And the drum had a credible voice, which the church has lost. Responsible stewardship, therefore, requires that we refrain from creating little pockets of hell within the view that Sunday will create a small pocket of heaven that we will leave at the door of the church as we process back to the pockets of hell. The Christian faith is not escapism into a bubble of holy bliss. It demands holy indignation that challenges all systems so that there is a balance in life. The absence of temples or shrines specifically set for worship of the supreme being or great spirit in the African tradition reflects the lack of limitation or dualistic approach to life. The values, ethics, and gospel imperative must infiltrate daily lives. Africans' first church is the home, its nature, and its all people. And that is why a lot of African-initiated churches worship in the open field or under a tree, for the world is seen as God's temple. Christ was not worshipped in a synagogue or a church, but wherever he went, he was worshipped, and the world was his parish. In the same way, the church cannot domesticate God because the drum beats in community. Igosa dances in community, and community is the whole of creation. The interconnectedness of life propels us to expand the gospel message into the entire household of God with a recognition that human beings are part of the ecosystem. To be igosa and to beat the drum is a calling that comes at a great cost, but it is a sacred privilege. In Zulu tradition, amagosa are not paid, yet their service benefits both themselves and the community. And that is diaconia, service as a theological imperative. It is William Temple who once said, "The church is the only society that exists for the benefit of those who are not its members." If the church is to steward responsibly, it must address economic and political injustices. Clemens said, Mark, reflecting on Pope Francis' vision of a church of the poor, writes, "A church of the poor does not just happen. It is the result of choice and commitment. Indifference comes not from lack, but from having too much worldliness." Clemens further argues that the indifference in the face of poverty is not due to a lack of something, but rather having too much of something, and that something in this case is worldliness. The church is too full of desires for convenience, for comfort, for maintenance, which leads to the indifference we see, because tending to the poor disturbs the budget. It takes away our big multi-million rand conventions and events. And so the church is full. It is for this reason that Pope Francis, in his Lenten message in 2014, said, "A church of the poor is an emptied church. It is an empty church in which the Spirit can dwell." It is important to note that the African drum is hollow. It is empty on the inside. If it was not hollow, the sound would be muffled due to the fullness. The sound echoes to vibrations within the drum. Responsible stewardship challenges the church to empty itself of corruption, of worldliness, of materialism, empire tendencies, self-enrichment, and maintenance behavior, so that it can reclaim its credibility and prophetic voice. A full church is inaudible as its voice is muffled, and cannot, with credibility, advocate for the poor because we are indifferent. Responsible stewardship, therefore, calls for self-emptying for service, so that the church becomes part of the solutions and the heartbeat of the millions who suffer. And so, as I conclude, in this paper, I have utilized theo-decolonial imagination to retrieve African imagery. The drum and igosa have been used as metaphors for the church's role in climate change, food security, and socio-economic justice in South Africa, with a particular focus on responsible stewardship. I offered you the imagery of igosa in the traditional Zulu dance and the drum as examples of primal living, and drew parallels between these two images and the church's role in responsible stewardship. In this multifaceted paper, I deduced that responsible stewardship encompasses recognition of human moral agency, reframing stewardship as response to abundance, not burden, embracing the church's charismatic prophetic role, I offered to us that an understanding of humanity as part of the ecosystem is critical for responsible stewardship. Ethical management of God's household is necessary. Deepened community and fellowship and recognizing the interconnectedness of life with all creation is necessary. And I called us to service, a service that responds to the cries of God's creation. As I conclude, that's what preachers would say 10 times. I'm used to preaching, not papers. As I conclude, I offer a lesson again from African culture. One of the first things I was taught as a teenager was cooking. And one thing I grew to know how to do was ukuphaka, dishing up the food and serving the food. It was through observing my mother and the spirit of selfless service that I adopted the principles of serving food. Such are embodied and part of the natural rhythm of life. Nobody tells you, you just learn them, and they become second nature as you grow up in community. The main rules when you serve others food is that everyone must have a plate of food. If the food runs out, the person ophakayo who is dishing up, who is serving, must sacrifice their own plate so that others can eat. Always make allowances for guests by having leftovers. No one should enter your home and leave hungry. Another important rule: it is unacceptable for one to dish up the best cuts for themselves. It's an unspoken rule. The one serving tends to their own needs last and honors others first for harmony to prevail in the household. There is a recognition that at the point of serving, you hold all the power because you control who gets what. However, as a steward who should act responsibly and care for all, including the traveler, that power must be tempered by a spirit of service. In the same way, humanity has been given dominance on earth and holds the pot. However, the masses will revolt and nature will react if we human beings do not handle economic, political, and ecological responsibility ethically. Thus far, we have failed dismally at this. The pot has arrived. It's ready. For indeed, the earth is the Lord's, and all in it. He made it. The pot is ready. Alas, we have taken the best cuts for ourselves. Through irresponsible resource extraction, land alteration, unsustainable consumption patterns, all of which have resulted in deforestation, climate change, and loss of biodiversity. When given the pot, humanity has failed ukuphaka. And each one has taken the best cuts through inequality, unstable economies, greed, inefficiency, and corruption. And all of these have resulted in the shortage of food and a myriad of social, economic challenges plaguing the nation and the world. We have failed to dish up justly, and now the earth groans, the masses revolt, nature responds and reacts. Responsible stewardship calls us to dish up differently, to dish up with justice, with care, and with love. The drum must beat, the igosa must dance, and the church must lead. Thank you.